bite marks on the body of the victim, fibers matching the murdered girl's clothing, DNA extracted from a rock used to crush the victim's skull. Forensic science is at the heart of how we solve criminal cases today. As we can see right now with the exhuming of mass graves and the careful collection of evidence in Ukraine, forensic science can also be used to shed light on crimes committed by political regimes. In the case of Spain, forensic science has been instrumental in shattering the silence about the crimes of the Civil War and the Franco era. To learn more about the development of the international forensic science movement and how it has transformed the memory landscape in Spain, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Nicole Iturriaga from the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society at the University of California, Irvine, to discuss her recent book, Exhuming Violent Histories, Forensics, Memory, and Rewriting Spain's Past. Nicole, thank you for joining this episode of Realms of Memory.
Thank you so much for having me.
One of the things that struck me reading your book is just how traumatic this past is. I mean, this past that the Spanish, it sounds like, are really only beginning to try to come to terms with. So I was hoping you could begin by explaining how can we begin to understand the extent of the violence and what was behind it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So Spain, in that point in the early 30s, had mostly been, it was sort of feudalism as a system, a lot of power in a small group of people, a lot of wealth as well, and they were able to remove the monarchy and start what they called the Second Republic, which was like a big change in that time period. So you have the early 30s, you have the rise of global fascism pretty much everywhere else on the European continent. And then you have this push for democracy, self-rule in Spain. And that brought in a lot of big changes, a lot of agrarian reform, wealth redistribution efforts, which left a lot of people who were wealthier and supportive of traditional power structures, such as the Catholic Church, feeling very unhappy. There's also a long history of military coups or very intense militarized presence in the Spanish history at that point. And that was one of the reasons why General Francisco Franco was placed in far away from the capital, from the country even, and he was placed in sort of colonized Spanish Morocco to prevent a potential coup. The problem is that distance is also what led people like Franco the chance to plan from far away without necessarily being noticed. The violence was, like Covadonga and all of that, is a reference to the retaking of Spain from the Moors. The idea similarly was that there was an invading, quote unquote, sort of, if you will, savage force that had taken over Spain and needed to be removed. And in this case, it was Marxism or leftist progressive ideas that needed to be crushed and Catholic conservative Spain restored. And so what we see with the coup, which we just passed the anniversary of, which was July 18th, and I'm not, it's too early for me to be doing math, but it's, 80 something years. And so they launched in from the south. But what happened was also that different factions of the military fractured, and the level of violence, according to various historians, who focus specifically on the Spanish War, because this is a massive literature. So if you do want to get further into it, Paul Preston's probably a great place to start. But it was extremely violent and vicious. I believe the way it's discussed is that this type of violence had only ever been saved for colonial conquests. So this was extremely violent. I think the hopes were, at least from the military perspective, was if it's extremely intense, people will capitulate quicker. There won't be a resistance if we crush them. And this also included very intense gender violence, sexual violence against women. Women of what was seen like of the left were particularly targeted as they were seen as both traitors to Spain and to their sex. And so there was a lot of violence there. And it was extremely brutal, even in places where they didn't face resistance, like up in Galicia that never fell immediately, were very sympathetic. There was extreme repression there, a lot of disappearances, a lot of torture, a lot of rape. So yeah, that it was very, very intense violence that just escalated and continued with the war.
And again, what struck me is because when you read about or teach about the history of empire, normally it's, well, you have the reconquest, that's the stepping off point, and that kind of explains the violence, that they're picking up where they left off. But in this case, it's turned towards the metropole, right? It's that history that's turned back on its own people. At least if there's a ferocity of violence and an attitude towards the enemy side, it seems like it's focused on the enemy within.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think they felt very betrayed by their fellow Spaniards, and they wanted, and I think in some cases, some authors have argued that the amount of violence that happened, especially in the southern part of Spain, was racialized, because the people who live there tend to look a little darker, and so there's a racialized element of they're not even Spaniards; they're just the remnants of the Moors who took over Spain, however many hundred years before. Some have even called that a genocide, because the violence in the southern part of Spain was extreme.
And my sense too is that you, on the one hand, you have maybe a historically driven type of violence and perception of the other side, and then you have something that's scientific and that's pseudo-scientific and that's very modern. And you mentioned this particular psychiatrist that had an influence on Franco, and that's tied into maybe the targeting and treatment of women and their children. Could you elaborate on that particular person?
Yeah, absolutely. So he was trained in Germany, and this is also, historically speaking, eugenics was a big science of the time, and it came out of the United States and went to German schools. And this particular person, again, I'm so sorry, I'm blanking on his name, but he, trained
Antonio
in Germany.
Viejo.
Yes.
And I think Antonio Viejo Nejera. I'm going to mispronounce it.
Yeah, so he had gotten his training in sort of like eugenics typed psychology. At this time, they're also trying to figure out if there's a biological component to political ideology. So the idea, and in this you will see again pop up in places like Argentina in the 70s and 80s, of the idea that Marxism is being given to children through family systems. With the is it biological? Is it nurture? Nature versus nurture. But either way, the best course of action is to remove small nonverbal children from their parents of origin, like their biological parents, and give them to good Catholic conservative families who will stomp out any kind of leftism. It is also how you get a really great way of dehumanizing people. So if you see them as a cancer, the only way to, heal the body, if you will, is to cut it out, and you can justify a lot. So at the end of the war, Franco was using, or his regime was using this sort of psychological perspective that women were particularly susceptible to communism, Marxism, leftist thought, and that they were really dangerous and had to be super controlled. And women who were mothers and leftists, their children should be removed or put in homes or, sterilized, things like that. This led to a bit of a baby stealing campaign amongst nuns at that time. So this is also, we're talking almost 100 years ago. Most women were giving birth in birthing clinics. So the nuns had people weren't giving birth in hospitals, is what I'm trying to say. So nuns were really involved in people giving birth. And at that time, they were also putting women under during the birthing process. So they're giving them ether or whatnot. So they're not present. And so they would come in, give birth, and then be told that the baby had died during the birthing process and that the Catholic Church would cover the cost of the funeral, this and that. And then it wasn't really until 2014 that someone confessed on their deathbed that they had bought their children from a nun. And this uncovered a massive baby trafficking campaign that started ideologically with the regime and then sort of evolved into just money making for the nuns. And it continued way past the dictatorship, like into the 80s. So they think it's about 300,000 children were stolen this way.
So when you think about, who is the enemy, I mean, it is just cast in a very broad way. It's not just the enemy combatant. It's the extended family.
Oh, absolutely. And the thing about the regime is they punished the Republicans and their families forever. They were second-class citizens. They weren't allowed to have certain kind of jobs. A lot of, they had their property seized, their businesses seized. They weren't allowed to leave without permission. They weren't allowed, the children weren't allowed vaccinations. It was just constant punishment for almost 40 years.
So if you're looking at just the sheer numbers, can you give a sense of the scale, the scope of people who are affected?
Oh, it was millions. I mean, millions of people voted for the Second Republic. And that was how if you were in a union, you could be executed. So it was as simple as that. Things that had been very much legal before it was sort of ex post facto law. You're being held accountable for things that weren't illegal at the time that you were engaging them. So this was millions of people who were terrified. And a lot of people left Spain, right? I mean, there was a huge Spanish Civil War refugee population that left. And then those who couldn't leave, that were stuck behind if they were on the losing side, were just in a really tough situation for a really, really long time. And I'm talking millions of people.
So the conflict comes to an end in 1939. And how does the regime continue to silence and stigmatize the other side?
Well, they start with just executing thousands of people, prisoners of war, people who had just fought on the other side. In my book, I discuss one gentleman who was just the president of a union. Like I said, anything could still get you killed, and they were killing thousands of people in 1939. Franco was famously signing sheaves of execution declarations over coffee, and hundreds of thousands more were placed in sort of slave labor in re-education camps, if you will. So a lot of the infrastructure projects that were done in the 40s in Spain were done by these prisoners who, so they executed a bunch of people. They also did very long internments, so like 40 years in a day kind of internments. And in those prison camps, they're being worked to death. The very famous Valley of the Fallen monument to the nationalist cause was built by slaves, many who died working on it. They didn't care about safety conditions or food or things like that. So a lot of the dams, the aquifers, roads, highways were done by people who were incarcerated. It was just extremely punitive. They also, so if you start off with sowing just total terror, you scare everyone that way. And then you're seizing property, you're, seizing people's businesses, their ability to, their farms, things like that. You have successfully created a second class group of citizens who are barely surviving. There was also an insurgency guerrilla movement of the Maquis who lived in the mountains for many years. They were all hunted down by around 1950. They were all gone. Gone meaning they were basically all executed. And so you also have total control of media, news, education. And so you also have the Catholic Church was extremely powerful. Priests were taking note of who was coming to Mass. There was no choice here. It was capitulate or die and or suffer very severe consequences that you were probably already suffering anyway. But it was really, really hard times. And there was a big, famine at one point, and that, what's his name out in Argentina? Perón sent a bunch of wheat from Argentina because they were, sort of fascist buddies, which saved Spain from starvation. But Franco was smart in that when he saw the World War II turning the way it was, when he realized who was going to win and who wasn't, he declared himself anti-communist and allied with the United States. And the United States helped support Franco for a really long time in exchange for military bases. So he had a lot of support. But yeah, it was really intense. He also created a lot of national holidays. So any chance that the regime had to glorify themselves and vilify the losing side, they took it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. So on the one hand, you get this continued repression, a silencing of the other side, and then you have the state that's in a position to construct the narrative, and it's a narrative that lives on, like beyond it, well beyond 1975, right?
Oh yeah, well beyond it.
How does it cast that particular past?
Well, I mean, if you can imagine having total control, like the state was able to create holidays. It turned every holiday, every saint day, which is, there's a lot of them in Spain. There's a lot of holidays, all became glorifications of the regime. He himself, started naming himself like the Claudio. He's, from God, it's like a really reinstating of old Spanish beliefs that, like, you wouldn't think would have gone into the 20th century. But, they made all school children sing, Face of the Sun every morning, which is sort of like a fascist anthem. So all the school books were also all about how this war was necessary to protect Spain from red violence and red terror. And it was sort of a rewriting of that their violence was justified because during the war, there had been some retaliatory violence by the Second Republic, or, the left, if you will. But that was used as a justification for the violence anyway, even though that doesn't logically make sense since they started the war. But it doesn't matter. They had sex segregated schools. They, did everything they could to indoctrinate the youth, as well as consistently instilling, like, oh, by the way, the violence could come back if we're not in power, like, you better watch out. Like, it was always a sprinkling of, like, isn't it great how stable everything is? But remember, it could change, like, at any point. And like really good sort of typical fascist, Franco was really enamored with celebrating himself and his movement. So there's monuments and street names everywhere. And they also did this on every church. They would list the names of the locals in the town who died in the war fighting for the nationalist cause. These things are everywhere. When I say everywhere, I mean they are everywhere. If you're looking for it, you can find it, especially in rural parts of Spain. The historical memory.
So I wonder.
Go ahead.
Is this almost like World War I monuments when you travel around Europe, that you're seeing this everywhere?
Yeah, it's like all public buildings at one point, and all churches had the names of all of the people who died in those towns, like those World War I monuments, except they're just one side, and they're not the democratic side. It's also, maybe it's more akin to World War I, World War II monuments in Germany that do exist, but are, they're subdued, but much more present. I mean, they're everywhere. The town that I was living in at one point, even the church in the stained glass windows had the Falangist seal on it, which is, the Franco's political party was in the church as part of their stained glass windows.
And this is decades after the transition to democracy.
That was 2015. Yeah, it's still there.
And if you don't understand the extent and the scale and the impact of the trauma, right, you can't begin to grasp, well, how in a democracy wasn't their reaction to that? Didn't they have means to bring about change?
Absolutely. If you think about, like, say your family was repressed and harassed, seeing signs like that in the local church or on the streets, it's really threatening, and it's constant. It's everywhere. Street names, school names, just everything. It's a constant reminder that your life is in danger. It's very stressful.
You get to 1975, and there is a successor, but he's assassinated, right? And there's this transition, like a 3-year transition to democracy. And once again, right, Spain is a democratic republic. So how does it deal with that past?
It doesn't. So if you think about it, they had almost 40 years, the regime, to instill its narrative. It's a very long time to constantly be worrying people that violence could happen after tremendous violence. You have a huge trauma that is compounded by more trauma and fear. And this regime is still executing people until the 70s, right? Before 74, 73, they're still executing by garrote, which is like a wire that's placed around your throat and it asphyxiates you horrifically. So it's not like it's not a violent regime. It's just not as violent. And so when Franco dies, it takes a while, but the political elites decide that because they are afraid that this will lead to more violence, they make what's called the Pact of Forgetting, which is this idea that we'll just not talk about the past. We're moving forward. We're moving into the future. We're leaving the past behind. That's it. This also included the Amnesty Law of 1977, which gave blanket amnesty to both, quote unquote, both sides. Now, I said earlier that people were serving extremely long prison sentences. So at the time of the transition, people were still in prison from 1939. And so part of the amnesty laws were to get those people out. What it effectively did, though, it did get those people out, but it also gave every person who had been in the regime or who had committed human rights abuses, because there's also a ton of torture happening throughout the regime. They really liked torturing people. There's in Puerto del Sol, there's a building there that on New Year's they do the grapes and stuff, but the basement of that building is where they held people and tortured them. It's a big tourist location. But so this was an ongoing thing. All those people who were torturing people, things like that, were given amnesty. And effectively what they did was they just sort of took all of the structure, all of the people, all the institutions, and they just moved it over into the democracy. So you didn't see what, if you remember the war in Iraq, they're talking about like de-Baathification or denazification, where you'd rebuild everything. And none of that happened in Spain. They just kept everybody and they just moved them over. So the judges, the lawyers, everything from the institutions of the Franco regime came forward into the democracy. So you're not going to see a lot of sympathy for anything other than let's pretend like nothing's changed, except now we call it a democracy.
Basically, a lot of people who are complicit in that past continue on in their jobs, whether they're
Absolutely.
Teachers or judges or
no accountability whatsoever.
But in part of that amnesty law, part of that the failure to carry out any kind of institutional reform, it's based on what the very real fear of a military coup, right? And there is an attempted coup, so there's a concern.
Yeah, and there was violence in that time period. There were a bunch of lawyers. If you go to Spain near the Atocha train station, it's a little further up, kind of near Lavapiés. I think it's Antonio Martin is the station. There's a statue of men sort of huddled around, like with their arms around each other. And that's reference to a bunch of, pro-democracy lawyers that were assassinated in the building across the street by, somebody who really didn't want democracy, was a fascist. So you have targeted assassinations at that point. You have a lot of violence. You do have violence. And then in 1981, you have a coup attempt by a group of the Guardia Civil who come into parliament with guns. I would encourage people to look up those images because they are quite dramatic. And they're, put down and they go to jail. But that was seen as a big test of the democracy. It was also seen as evidence to families, Republican families, that they can't trust the democracy. Because these men also had lists of people they wanted to kill. They were, mostly leftists, things like that. And so it was evidence of see, this is why if you lift your head up, you get your head chopped off. So it was used as a way to really reify silence is for the best.
Because the government was still on a really fragile footing, right? And then if you fast forward even into the 1990s, because you mentioned, things start to change, right? That there are artists and journalists, academics who start to talk about this past in the 1990s. And then I was just fascinated by the story of this particular judge. There's a judge who, and I guess this is even pushing into the 2000s, right? who takes a strong stand against this past. And is this, I mean, the reality of even decades later of institutional continuity that he runs up against?
Oh, yeah. It's incredible. So Baltasar Garzón really spearheaded the universal jurisdiction law. It's an international law that argues that any state can hold anybody accountable for, horrific crimes such as genocide, disappearances, things like that. So human rights abuses can be adjudicated by any court. So it sort of makes an international court really important. And he put out an arrest warrant for Pinochet, who was the former dictator of Chile, who, funnily enough, also attended Franco's funeral, which was a really interesting little side fact. But he was vacationing in the UK. Garzón put out an arrest warrant for him for crimes against humanity. And it started this massive international diplomatic crisis. The UK did not know what to do. People were sort of freaking out on all sides. My father's from Chile, so this was like, I remember this really vividly as like, oh, wow. People flew out there. Anyway, so he was under house arrest for like almost 2 years, if not, I think maybe more, until he pretended to have dementia as a sort of a way to get out of it. And they gave him a humanitarian release and he went home. But it caused all these conversations to happen in Spain about, well, why are we prosecuting someone else's war criminals when we have a whole bunch at home? And this person named Emilio Silva, who's a sociologist and a journalist, wrote an article that said, my grandfather also was a desaparecido, or a disappeared person, which is a commonly used word for disappearances from Latin America during the regimes there. It's a little different. I just want to say that's a little different than what happened in Spain, in that people knew what happened to them and more or less kind of where they were. Whereas in Latin America, they literally just went poof. Nobody knew what happened to them. But not poof, they were killed. But he writes this article, he puts his name and address on the bottom, and he gets a call from a forensic anthropologist who said, I think I can help you find your grandfather. And that's what starts this whole new historical memory movement. But up until that point, no one's really talking about the past, or if they are, it's still kind of tentative. Maybe it's an artwork, media, but it's pretty quiet, and I just want to say that the thing in like democratic transition theories at that time hold up Spain as the way to do this. This was seen, the pacted negotiated transition was seen as the most successful way to do that. And that holds until the early to mid 80s, where you have Argentina transitioning. But even there, they go back to amnesty and sort of silencing. Chile transitioned the same exact way that Spain did. And that doesn't really change until you start seeing Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa. So things change a lot in the evolution of how we understand what's the best course of action for countries that are transitioning into democracy after authoritarianism. But Spain, and I would like to say also that, these are really, really intense times. Everything is so raw. People are on edge, looking for stability. It is a very difficult time. And there's a lot of debate about whether or not political stability can be maintained if you are holding people accountable immediately.
And for decades, there's been the government indoctrinating people that be careful, be careful what kind of changes here, what you look into.
Absolutely.
But you mentioned there is this historical memory law, right? In 2007,
Mm-hmm.
Was that intended to go farther than it did? It seems like a measure that just ends up falling short.
Yeah. So the reason that got there is that Emilio Silva, with the help of some forensic professionals, were able to find his grandfather and the 12 other people he was killed and buried with. And then he's identified with DNA testing later that year. And it just explodes in Spain. All of a sudden, families from different Republicans are like, well, I want that. If you can think if over 114 to 140,000 people were in mass graves, that's a lot of families who are looking for loved ones. And so then this movement happens, and Emilio Silva and Santiago Macias start this association for the recovery of historical memory. It explodes across Spain. And it's really expensive to do this, to be trying to exhume. There's also other groups. There's Forum for Memory. There's all these different groups that are trying to start this exhumation process. And they're also calling for memories. So the association in the early years would go on radio stations, TV shows, and ask for the older generations to send them their memories of the war, of the violence, of people they knew were killed, where they thought they were killed. When I was volunteering with the association, that was one of my jobs, actually, was to go through letters, my handwritten letters that were sent to the association to pull out information of possible graves and victims. And we're talking thousands. I mean, people sent thousands. They're like, I heard this on the news program. And so you have this opening up of memory, not just of graves at this time, which I think is really important, is like the feeling of safety and security is still not entirely there, but there's an invitation for people to walk through a door. But
it's that initial, it's Emilio Silva, right? That initial exhumation, right? That opens a floodgate of memories, a demand from the thousands of other families who've lost loved ones to be able to do the same, to find them, right?
Yeah. And it's a truly tremendous thing. In some ways he sort of stumbled into. I don't know if that was what he thought would happen when he wrote that article. And we've got to remember, like, DNA testing as an option. Well, DNA testing in its existence is still relatively new. It wasn't really around until 1989. And it's expensive. It's hard to get. And so like, this is the year 2000. It's still kind of like wow, what do you mean you can identify bones and stuff like that? So it was very cool, and people really wanted it. And there was a deep need there it's been a long time.
Just to go backwards a little bit. So there's this first exhumation that happens, but there's also a prehistory, right? And that this whole forensic human rights movement really goes back to the 1980s, right? In Argentina, it lays the groundwork for what happens in Spain, and then there's collaboration that you talk about in the last chapter. So how does Argentina play this leading role in this global forensic human rights movement? How does this evolve and develop?
It's one of my favorite aspects of this story, because like, I like to think of it as sort of, you have two timelines, right? You have Spain, they have their war, they have their scientists and all that, the dictatorship. And simultaneously, you have Argentina that's existing. Perón is friends with Franco. They're sending, when Perón gets exiled, he goes to Spain. He's there for a really long time. He comes back to Argentina, re-wins election, almost immediately dies, and his wife takes over. This is around the same time that you have a rise in revolutionary leftist movements, especially in the global South. And so there's this tension, again, that we saw in the 30s is repeating in the 70s, 60s, 70s of, wanting change, social change, and the pushback of the old guard. They use extremely similar logic in the dictatorship in Argentina, which was a military junta, this idea that Marxism can be rooted out through family systems. And so you see the stealing of children who were born in captivity or taken at nonverbal ages and then illegally adopted out to families, in that like they were being presented as their own biological children. Their origins were completely disappeared, if you will. Their parents are killed. 30,000 people, are disappeared through clandestine prisons and killed. It's, again, extremely repressive and violent, except it's not visible there. It's like people are just going missing. And then, the regime sort of starts to cannibalize itself. It gets into this stupid fight with the UK over the Falkland Islands. Maybe Argentinians will be mad at me for saying that, but it starts this war that they lose. And because of that, they also lose a lot of power. But at the same time, there's families who are like, where are my children? Where are my grandchildren? And there's no way at this point to use any kind of science to be like, that child belongs to this family or not. But these women, the grandmothers and the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, really built relationships with foreign scientists to help them, because they knew that one day the regime would fall and science might be the answer. And that's exactly what happened. The regime transitioned in 83, and the transitional government invited different experts to come and help them. And one of them was Dr. Clyde Snow, who was an American forensic anthropologist who's really famous at that time for having identified the skull of Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor. So he's sort of already well known. He goes to Argentina. He gives a presentation to a group of family members and transition officials about the power of forensic anthropology. This man comes up to him and says, "Is it possible for a baby to dissolve?" And he's like, "What?" And he's like, "Well, my family, my daughter and her family were killed in a shootout with the police, but the morgue worker told us that the baby was so tender that she just dissolved like water. Is that possible?" And Dr. Clyde Snow asks if he can do an exhumation of the family, and he's granted this permission. And what he finds is that official story of a shootout was a complete lie. The family had been executed within 30 centimeters, and that the remains in the baby's casket belonged to an adult foot that had decomposed somewhere else, which suggested that the baby lived and was somewhere not near the family. There was another exhumation that they did of Estela de Carlado, who's the current president of the Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo's daughter. She was lucky in that she got her daughter's body back. So if you give live birth, it scars the pelvic bones in a particular way. So her remains had this pelvic scarring. And so Clyde Snow said, "You're a grandmother." But again, there was no baby. There was no fetal remains. There was nothing. So there's all this evidence that starts building up that there are missing children. And so you start to see people going, wait a minute, how do we have all this evidence? And by the way, all this evidence completely contradicts what the state is saying has happened. And so this evidence was used in the trial against the generals. They were convicted, but the military was very upset by being held accountable. They threatened again to have another coup. So the next president, Menem, gave everybody blanket amnesty. Along the same time, there are genetic scientists who are working on blood testing, which at that time was not quite DNA yet, but it was able to do sort of like basic paternity, basic relation, like allele testing. And so they were starting to use that. You're getting a lot of testimonies from people who survived the clandestine prisons or who are neighbors of a former military person who just showed up with a baby one day, who are giving this information to the grandmothers. Paula, I'm blanking on her last name, was the first child to be identified in 1989. And the family had claimed she was theirs biologically until blood testing proved that she did not belong to them at all, that she belonged to a couple, two disappeared people, and that she biologically was related to one of the grandmothers. This then turned into like adoption law. But eventually the grandmothers won due to the belief that you have the right to your biological identity and that you have certain rights. All, children have the right to their biological identities. But that changed everything. And that the state at that point had still been saying that this hadn't happened. But once they had the blood testing, it really revolutionized how people thought about what happened in the violence with the mass graves as well. Proof of torture, death flights. It's where they took people who were alive after being tortured horrifically. They drugged them and threw them out of airplanes alive. There was so much evidence that was collected from the forensic investigations in Argentina that it just changed everything there. That team then went around the global South and started teaching people how to do this on their own so that they wouldn't have to rely on sketchy governments, that they would be able to. And
that team, so that's
yes.
the Argentine forensic anthropology team, right?
Yes.
That really goes global.
Yeah. Oh man, they've changed the world completely. They start this team, Clyde Snow got a bunch of grad students from a university in Buenos Aires. They start this team. And then they go around, they set up one in Guatemala, they set up one in El Salvador, they set up one in Chile, Peru, most of that part of the global South that's going on until like the 90s. And then, the early 90s, you see the wars in the Balkans. They go and they help set up the lab in Bosnia-Herzegovina. They set up a lab in Cyprus from the war in the 70s and the occupation of northern Cyprus. They're just going around and doing this. And so again, if I bring your attention back to the timeline, like Spain is going along its transition, Argentina's blowing up, you have the rise of this sort of blood testing, Spain's in silence. You get to the 90s, this movement of forensics and human rights is really expanding. It's now on the European continent with Bosnia-Herzegovina. 1998, you have Pinochet being indicted. Hop to the year 2000, Emilio Silva writes his article, and it's very easy for forensics-based human rights to then intersect Spain. It was a long-winded way to answer that. Sorry.
But I mean, Argentina has already developed this and shown what you can do with forensic science to challenge the official narrative, to at least to try to begin to bring people to justice with this. Absolutely.
And Spain is different in a lot of the cases. So like you also have Guatemala, there's a genocide there. Forensic science is used to show like most of the victims were not quote unquote, guerrillas deserving of death, but they're small children, they're women, they're old people. These are, just a genocide of indigenous people. So like they've been showing constantly and across different cases and across different contexts that the science is not negotiable. Like it's brilliant in many ways to just be like, regardless of the politics, not even talking about why these people were targeted, we can say that this person died like this at this age with these wounds, and there's no way that you can change anybody's mind because that's just what the science says. The science doesn't have an agenda. The science doesn't have politics. It just has these answers. And then what you do with that, they kind of just go, and there you go, make up your own mind. And it's a really smart strategy.
So most of your book it's centered on this Association for the Recovery of Historical Memory. Do you pronounce it as ARM
it's,
for short?
The ARMH would be like probably the English version. Or the association.
The association?
Yeah. That's
so this plays the leading role in this forensic memory drive within Spain, and this is really the focus of most of the book. And you're breaking this down into their work on excavation sites, the classes they give, these homage and burial ceremonies, and they're all part of this process of trying to break the silence and reveal the truth of the past. And when you start into the excavation sites, I love the subtitle of that chapter, that this was a scientific Trojan horse, that you really, it's a way of kind of drawing people in unsuspecting and getting them to start talking about things in a way that they never have before, at least outside the confines of the home.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you talk a little bit about how does the work of this organization, how is it kind of like a performance that draws in these spectators and then makes them participants in the process?
Yeah, it's so in sociology we talk a lot about Goffman, who was sort of dramaturgical theory, this idea that we're all sort of actors and we have front stage, backstage, that we're all performing. The association goes into these towns, and there is a lot of performance. They have on their costumes, they have their official gear that's got their name on it. They have all their tools and technical stuff. So they have all their quote unquote props, and they go in and they start doing technical work. The thing about the violence is that a lot of people in these small towns know exactly where these graves allegedly are, through legend, through storytelling. And so if they see people with excavators and, they're in neon vests, or they have the association, the ARMH on their backs, they know kind of what's going on, and they're curious. And I think the thing that's interesting about this performance is that curiosity tends to overpower ideology in many ways. People just want to know. Especially in small, like rural towns as well. There's not a lot going on. So something new and something new at all is intriguing, and people will come and they'll ask questions like, what are you doing? Or, oh my gosh, are you looking for so-and-so, the person who would maybe be in the grave? And that's such an easy way to start a conversation. They also put up sometimes their sign on the road so that people will know immediately what they're doing and then have questions. Or if they come and look at it, they'll send someone and go, "Hi, how are you? What do you know? Like, do you live around here?" It's such an easy entry point. And then people want to help usually. There's so many times where I heard people say, "Well, I don't believe in this, but here's what I've been told. This is where I think the grave is, like, blah, blah, blah. And then we'll wish you luck." So it's interesting. And they usually come back too, because people, again, want to know what you're doing, how far you got, especially if there's remains that have been found. People want to see them. And that's how you can get them to take one of those classes at the foot of the grave where they're explaining. Again, they start science first through the crash course of like what they're doing technically. And then they lead into a more politically charged conversation about whether this violence was justified. Does the state have a responsibility to the victims? And what about all the people's bodies who are still littering the countryside? And in that way, it's sneaky, but it's really clever. And it does encourage just storytelling and testimony giving about what these people know, how they feel about it. It's really, they also encourage a lot of the elders.
But they benefit, right? They benefit from popular culture, right? As
Absolutely.
well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, people love CSI. They love Bones, things like that. And so they benefit from this previous knowledge of what they think forensic science is. And I would like to go on the record and say most of those shows are pretty inaccurate, if not entirely inaccurate, but it's good for the movement because people believe it, or at least feel familiar enough. Also, DNA testing is one of the most believed sciences out there. And most people know what it is. And that's, I think, really beneficial. You already have knowledge coming into something like this. You're not having to explain quantum physics to get people to buy in. They already know. They've seen it on TV and they're excited to be near it.
So you've got people's natural curiosity. You have how this whole process is staged, the benefit of popular culture that draws people in. And then once they get there, it seems to be that there's almost like a spontaneous storytelling that begins, right? Where the spectators become part of the performance, right? And what kind of stories do they open up with?
It depends. So a lot of times it's like, "Oh, well, I heard this when I was growing up. Like, oh, wasn't that terrible?" Sometimes you hear like, it was so bad. Usually it's stories of suffering. Sometimes if there's victims' families nearby, or even if it's not victims' families that are in the grave, but just people who suffered repression, they'll tell stories of what they heard. There was one where a man came and he just talked about what happened to his mom, to his grandmother, to this priest that used that position of power to be extremely abusive, things like that. So it would be like, "Let me tell you about my family that were killed and thrown in a well. Let me tell you about how my mom," this was very rare. People really didn't like talking about what happened to women, but sometimes people would talk about and he was actually quite rare, actually owning that he was related to a woman whose hair had been cut and was forced to drink castor oil and walk naked through the streets. Most of the time when people were talking about gendered sexual violence, it was in like well, what happens to women, and it was really bad. But a lot of times it would skirt those issues and come back to like, the men were killed, the property was seized, they threw them over this, part of the freeway. It would always come back to like, how can I help you guys find a grave, or, what else do you want to know, kind of thing. So you get a lot of like, this is what I heard growing up, or this is what was experienced in my family. And then sometimes it would turn into conversations about like the silence. That happened a lot, where people would say, "It's amazing that this is happening, that we can even have this conversation is such a sign of progress." That I heard that conversation a lot.
Yeah, that's something I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit on, because you could see people arguing, well, wouldn't these stories that people are opening up about, aren't they just reliving these really painful experiences, and it's just perpetuating the suffering, and that How is this something beneficial to encourage these people to come to the site, to encourage these conversations to happen? How is this a helpful process for the community, for the country?
Yeah, and I think that's definitely a critique that's lobbed against the historical memory movement a lot. I think they would counter with it, you need to be able to process and talk about things. I would say for the families, it's in some ways. So listen, like the state never did any kind of truth and reconciliation. There was never any attempt at any kind of memory work on the part of the state. So in some ways, these are sort of fill-in. They're not the best fill-ins, but sort of a version of a truth and reconciliation, or at least a truth commission, where people in the community are finally listening to people talk about the stories of the past. The other thing is that all the perpetrators are dead. This is just literal witnessing and listening. And I would say that that's actually really important for people who come from families that had repressed, that were victims of repression, because they're finally sort of forcing people to listen to them. Just to even acknowledge that this happened to them, I think is a huge win. And also, like, a lot of times people would bring younger, like teenagers or kids, and they might be the first time that they're hearing these stories. And that, I think, is important for the younger generations to not be completely ignorant to the history of their own countries. But like the witnessing, the testimony giving, no one seemed so overwhelmed that they were being traumatized. It was just more of a like, we finally have the capacity and ability to talk about this in public. And I think for also the victim side, like the Republican side, seeing that no one is getting arrested or dying after telling these stories, that it's safe, is also incredibly important. I would say that's actually important for everyone, to see that you can talk about these things without the violence coming back. Means you can trust your democracy. You can somewhat trust your neighbors not to kill you. And that goes against everything that they were taught for 40 years more at the transition, right? Is if you talk about this, bad things will happen. And now they're talking about it and nothing happened. I think it's incredibly empowering.
And you mentioned too, the truth telling. It's an important part of this reconciliation process, right? That if the state isn't doing it, that this is a part of the process of people doing this at the local level.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the thing is like, and I've said this before other places, but state terror leaves a mark and it lasts a really long time. And it's going to last even longer if you tell people they can't talk about it. It's intergenerational, and pretending like it didn't happen doesn't mean it didn't happen. And so giving people the opportunity to share and commune with their neighbors about shared tragedies, or tragedies that were forced in behind closed doors out of fear, is really reparative. And it's also, I would argue, like, how can you have a democracy if you're forcing people into silence about the past? Wounds have to breathe to heal. Some of this violence is almost 100 years old, and it's still this painful. So the old way didn't work.
But to go back to the point, so you have a chapter on classes, right? And you could argue that these classes are also another stealth approach to getting people to feel comfortable about talking about the past.
Definitely. Yes. Yeah. The classes are really interesting. So they invite people from the local town to come and learn about what they're doing. It's always presented as a science and history class. It's never presented as anything political. They start with, explaining the science, that they're using protocols based from the United Nations. They're showing the tools. They're explaining exactly what the workers are doing in the grave, and people are standing around an open pit and looking at skeletons. And then they move into like what the history was of the people. And this is when you also see locals jumping in, filling in details. So there's already this sort of co-collaborative experience. They're asking questions. And then it turns into like, let's look at signs of violence. So this person, for example, sometimes the thing about a mass grave is unless it's been disturbed, it looks exactly how it was left. So it's very clear. You don't have to do a lot of talking, because the skeletons, as I argue in my book, are doing the talking. You can see bullet holes. You can see broken bones. You can see personal items, things like that. You can see bullets. So it's very visceral. You don't have to do a lot of work here. But, usually the lead archaeologist will be like, here we have signs of torture, or this person has an entry wound from a bullet here. This is what we know with how old they were, what the story was. In the case of the one I start my book off with was a family of 4 with one woman who was 8 months pregnant. And then, she had one little red earring resting on her cranium and like a hair comb. And it's like, you can really tell a lot about this person just based on that information. And then being like, was she a threat to the state? Like, did she need to die like this? Did she need to stay alongside a road for this many years? Would, especially they also then start pulling from like, families have the right to bury their loved ones based in accordance to their values and not by the will of the people who murdered their loved ones. And so there's a lot of like very subtly throwing in, and then they sort of grow that critique of the state of like, we never talked about this. The state does not pay for this. There's no DNA base. But, there's lots of pointing out just sort of the failures of the Spanish state to do anything for the victims, and that the association covers the costs. They cover the costs of funerals, that they do all this so that families can get their loved ones back. And it's sort of a 1-2 punch, because you're hearing this critique of the state while also looking at a really visceral image that you could almost reach out and touch of people who died horrifically. And you can see so much. You can see their shoes, how they lived, maybe the type of fashion someone was interested in. And then you can imagine their very last moments of life while someone is narrating to you that the state has failed not only them, but everyone standing around there. It's extremely powerful. And it doesn't come off as extremely political. To say that families have the right to bury their loved ones doesn't come off like a political statement. And so it's really intense, and it's really beautifully done often. And I've seen some really interesting things come out of his classes, especially in the Q&A.
And then at the end, right there, the conversations, right? Mm-hmm. It ends with a conversation. That part I thought was striking, right? That if you want to talk about, well, what are the benefits of going through this, of getting people to talk? I mean, you really see some concrete things that come out of these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, so they do a Q&A thing afterwards, like, does anybody have any questions? And that's usually where you see exactly what you were saying, these like amazing moments of either clarity or truth. There was one where a judge was like, well, I still don't think, the state should have to pay for this. And then there was a whole conversation amongst the people there with a pretty important, powerful person of the state, a judge, going back and forth over what the memory law didn't do, what the rights of families are, what the rights, and obligations of the state are, like just true, what felt like true, like democratic Habermasian, if you will, ideas of how do we self-govern? What do we want from our government? What do we want from each other? And it was really interesting to watch. Another one was in a very small village where a local, the family members of the deceased were there as well, where someone said, I want to say I'm sorry for what was done to your family. We are the children of the perpetrators, if you will. And, we were told that these were bad people who deserved death. And like, it's been made very clear that that wasn't the case. And we want to apologize. And, everyone was crying, and they came over and they hugged each other. And it was one of the most incredibly powerful examples of what justice can look like outside of how we traditionally think of justice. This was such a moment of truth and reconciliation at its core. And I think what made it so also intense and real was that it happened over the bodies. They were literally out and you could see them and they were there. It really felt like everyone was present, the past, the present, the future, for the state of the country and its ability to heal these really old and open wounds. And so these moments, these conversations are just so important.
So when you turn to the burial ceremonies, the homage rituals. There, I think that the emphasis seems to be on how this gets amplified by press coverage, right?
Yeah.
That the press is announcing what's going to happen. They're covering the event after it's happened. And it's almost like they're picking up the script of this organization and even taking it beyond anything what this association could have hoped for. How does that work?
Oh, it's so in these local towns, like when they recover a body and then the family decides to do like an homage and reburial event, sometimes local newspapers will cover it. And that really, you're right, it amplifies the messaging because the association will put out a press release to the local press about these events. A press person will come and take pictures, talk to people. Sometimes these events are quite large and heavily covered. And again, like a lot of times these acts of violence that happened are well known. And so people know these stories. And so to have like a final chapter, if you will, about how it ends is very, I think, enticing for local newspapers. But what they do, what's interesting and what I talk about in my book is the choice words. Like you could say, like in the past, it would have been like, oh, they're executed, which would suggest that they were gone through a judicial process when they were found guilty and then executed by the state, versus using words like assassinated or murdered or killed by the state suggests that the state was maybe not necessarily working within the confines of law. And that I think that's also really important. It's how do we understand, how is the news discussing what we are hearing about? So if you're using passive voice, like someone was involved in an officer related shooting, like what happened, who shot who, there's no, like someone was shot, but who shot them is lost in passive voice. And in Spanish, it was also like, if you're using the word assassinated versus executed, you're making a distinction between whether this was a legally sanctioned killing or not. And that I think is really important. It's subtle, but it's also reframing an old narrative, right? It's recasting the victims as victims and not criminals who deserve to be killed by the state. And I think that's really important. Go ahead.
You're identifying a perpetrator, right?
Exactly. And the perpetrator being the state that was out of control. And you're also putting pictures of the victim in there. A lot of these, have pictures of the victims that are, smiling and they look sweet, or the family members, like especially if it's the living child, so they're old, they look so happy and sad, but like, you're like, oh my gosh, this poor woman, she's 92. All she wants was her dad back. That's very compelling. And it puts a sympathetic face on the whole story, right? Like there were people who paid terrible prices. They lost their parents at a young age to this tremendous violence, and now they finally got them back. And I think that part of the story is also really compelling and really part of this. That's justice. They are getting their story told at a higher level. And it's, because I do think it's important, these sort of micro interactions of storytelling, but having news coverage helps it get to that next sort of meso-societal level of like, oh, wow, did you read about this? That's so interesting. Like, of course she should have her dad back. Like all families have the right to bury their loved ones. It's almost a cultural universal belief. So I think that helps this movement really make a lot of headway. Because again, you're not talking about the politics of what happened. You're just talking about the basic needs of families to be able to move on.
And you mentioned as well, with these homage ceremonies, reburials, they're a form of reparative justice in that these people who have been disappeared, right, are reincorporated back into their names are mentioned again, that they're reincorporated back into the community, back into the nation.
Absolutely.
So they're made visible.
Absolutely. I mean, these people were rendered invisible by the state. They were wiped off the face of the earth and then forcibly forgotten. So to recover them, say their names out loud, reconnect the skeleton to their identity, publicly own them and say, this is not just our father or our friend, this is our neighbor, this is our a fellow Spanish citizen who's now going to be incorporated as part of the citizen dead, is extremely important. It is a form of justice, considering that the whole point of their death was to erase them from existing at all in any way.
And that's the necro power that you talk about, that the power that the state wields is not just to crush the enemy, but to silence them, but to completely erase them.
Exactly. And so this is a true triumph, I think, of the movement, for these families especially, and for their communities to say, you don't have the right to do that to anyone. This is a basic human right to exist, to be remembered, and, to be cared for in life and in death. And the state doesn't have the right to just make someone disappear.
And what was amazing was in this one case of this mother, Vincenta, and her son, Jesus, was that you get the involvement of the local mayor, the local town council, and these are conservatives, right? Yeah. These are people who are a part of the ruling party at the time that really was reluctant to offer any support for these kinds of initiatives.
Yeah, I would say obstinate. They were really anti-helping at all. So yeah, you have this really strange bedfellows, if you will. But I think what really resonated with that mayor was the injustice of these people's deaths, and that I think it was unconscionable to him that these people were just in an unmarked grave, buried without any kind of marker, and that the family wanted them back. I think it was in his power to make this happen. And, he held a moment of silence at their homage. And I remember people just around me being like, what is happening? Because he was so respectful, and he made everyone else go with him in this moment of silence. And people around me were joking like, oh, he's definitely not going to win his reelection. He did. I think he's still mayor. But it was stunning to everyone around me to see anybody in the opposition party being that respectful to quote unquote red murder victims.
And you mentioned what this is maybe as close as you're going to get to an official apology, right?
Absolutely.
At least at that point in time.
Absolutely. Yeah. From the state or any kind of local official capacity from a Spanish government. Things are changing there. I do believe they just passed a new democratic memory law. I am not as well versed, but it does seem like they're making very substantial changes to these memory laws and attempts to be more reparative and to sort of chip away at the amnesty law. Again, I'm not quite as comfortable speaking on that, other than I think they've made a huge amount of progress recently. But I don't think you get there without all these other steps in between, where you have.
I was so surprised by how little, there was so little news coverage of that, this sweeping change. I mean, there were articles I saw. I mean, this is just happening last week. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's not clear if this has even been enacted. I read that it was passed by a lower house, and that it could be enacted this week.
Yeah. I mean, it's still ongoing, but the fact that that's even happening it's incredible. The same thing with Franco being exhumed and reburied in a private ceremony. People thought that all hell was going to break loose, and nothing happened. I think there's the fear is. What I hope is happening is that people are realizing that these fears that have been embedded in their psyche across the transition and the regime are not founded in reality, that the democracy is stronger than people believe it to be. And I think part of that, the stepping stone approach here is you've had the association amongst other movements doing these reburial and homage ceremonies, the micro interactional work with people in local towns, and just building a very strong foundation of, we have to talk about this. The families have rights. Everyone has the right to recover their loved ones. Everyone has the right to science to find them. And the state does not have the right to disappear people forever or at all.
But you wonder how much of a consensus there is, at least in the political realm. Is this just a socialist government that's
and this is
allied with regional governments, right?
Yeah, I mean, the problem here also is that Spain, the historical memory law passed in 2007, 2008. And so then that law offered money to organizations like the association to do exhumations, things like that. It was supposed to remove all these fascist symbolism across the country. 2008, you have the housing crisis that just blows up the economy. And all of a sudden you have just so much economic hardship and pain in Spain, particularly, that like it kind of forces the conversation away from memory politics and into surviving. And I think, every time you sort of step forward, 2019 is when Franco was exhumed. He was exhumed in October 2019. I think what comes next. It's COVID. And it sort of like derails different memory politics in their attempts to move forward. But all the whole time, things like the association, they're still doing their thing. They're still exhuming. They're still working underneath that fray. But big changes like this always seem to get upset by either economic or public health crises that derail the focus and the need into something much more immediate.
Your final chapter, you're really getting at what's unique about this is that this is not just a Spanish memory movement, that this is international, and that there are a lot of things that happened that would never have happened if not for the international dimension of it. And this particular Spanish judge is part of the story, that there's a Spanish initiative to look into this past in 2008 that seems to go nowhere, right? And if change happens, it comes from Argentina.
Again, Argentina comes back. So this case that you're talking about so we see universal jurisdiction and Argentina make a reappearance, a very important one, where a judge in Argentina takes on opening a case into the Franco era crimes, including baby stealing, but also this woman, Ascension Mendieta Alcalá, who really wanted to find her dad before he died. She knew where he was. He was executed in that 1939 massive purge. Her dad was the president of a local union. He was executed with like 44 other people the same day. These plots line what would have been the civil cemetery at that time in Guadalajara, Spain. And the reason they got there is because other courts in the EU and in Spain had denied petitions for inquiry based on, it's been too long, or, in Spain because of the amnesty law. They found this sympathetic court in Argentina, and Argentina's really open to universal jurisdiction because of their past. They've also done a lot of ratification of international treaties and laws that make them able to do this type of law, international law. And Maria Servini de Cubria is the judge. And long story short, she mandated an exhumation order for Timoteo, the father of Ascension. In that first exhumation happened in 2016. They opened up plot 2 in the cemetery there. They exhumed about 25 people. In it, they did DNA analysis, and he wasn't in there. So they were able to get a second mandated order to open up plot 1. And he was found in there. But this is truly incredible because Spain did not have to comply. I mean, that's the thing about international law, is they can go, no, I'm not going to do that. That happens all the time with extradition orders or things like that. And there are extradition orders from this same judge that Spain has completely ignored. But for whatever reason, they were able to convince the local magistrate to allow these exhumations. There were definitely a lot of hiccups here and there. At one point, they wanted to, so after all these bodies were analyzed, there's family members who are also, outside of Ascension, but other families, who are of the other victims, waiting for these bones so they can rebury them. And the local city government demanded that the association rebury anyone that wasn't Timoteo, because they're like, the order only was for him. And they got so much bad press that because basically what they were asking the association to do was to recreate the mass grave, as opposed to like, the bodies are already out.
Just put them back.
Put them back.
We didn't find the right person.
So all these people have to go back to their mass grave. Like, back you go into the ground, even though we know who you are and your families are asking for, the remains to be returned. You don't get them back because the order was only for one person. It's extremely punitive. And I think really a good reflection of how that status quo of losers and winners maintains this was 2017 when this was going on. So not that long ago.
And you mentioned this same conservative government had spent money on repatriating bodies of soldiers from the Blue Division, right?
Yes, that were fighting alongside Hitler against the Allied forces. They had paid for those bodies to be exhumed in a foreign country and repatriated. But this, which they paid no money for, they were also demanding money for just that the team was there in a public space. They wanted money for it. They eventually, due to these sort of bad actions, were hacked by the hacktivist organization Anonymous until they dropped it. But so there's a lot of transnational advocacy networks going on at play in this last chapter, this conversation about Ascension and these exhumations. And the association has continued to exhume. So there's at least 16 plots that hold somewhere between 24 to 30 people along this wall. They've, I think, opened up 6 of the plots. The first 2 were mandated by the judge, but because they were able to get so much momentum and positive press and response, they were able to maintain opening up these graves without the intervention of a foreign government. And I mean, that's a couple of hundred people who are now returned to their families that would not have been otherwise. Ascension did get her dad back. She reburied him before she died, before she passed in 2019. And that was what she wanted more than anything, was to get her dad back and rebury him before she herself passed.
And you mentioned, well, this universal jurisdiction, really, it sets a powerful precedent for how other countries can initiate kind of a judicial process against other countries. Even individuals can do this, right? I
think last week it was Sweden who used universal jurisdiction to try and convict a former Iranian official for a massacre that happened in Iran in the 80s of 2,000, 3,000 people. You see this in German courts adjudicating former ISIS combatants. That happened last year. I mean, so universal jurisdiction is expanding. There was one, I think it was in Germany, from somebody who was a Syrian official who was responsible for running a torture center for the Assad regime, was convicted of crimes against humanity. So it's expanding. Just check the news. It seems like every week or every month, there's a new case of universal jurisdiction. More present maybe is the war in the Ukraine. Different countries are wanting to use universal jurisdiction to hold Russia accountable for war crimes. So this is an increasingly used and popular tool to hold state individuals and officials accountable for their behaviors and actions outside of their home countries where you would normally be held accountable. This is a way of holding people accountable outside of where they would normally be facing justice.
And the important thing here is there's no statute of limitations, right? If this is deemed a crime against humanity, right? So if you're collecting evidence in the Ukraine now, well, it could take time, but
yeah, I mean, what's fascinating about Ukraine is what's interesting coming from a sort of a forensics perspective is just how quickly they've gone in there. Like the other day I was watching the news and there was a story of a residential building being bombed, and that the first thing you see image-wise is forensic workers recovering bodies and remains for legal and also identification purposes, but also that they're collecting evidence, or they are already planning their evidence to be, used in crimes against humanity. I think the other thing about this use of universal jurisdiction is really reinforcing the idea that there is no statute of limitations for crimes against humanity, that you can always be held accountable. You are always responsible for your actions, no matter how much time has passed. And regardless if your country has amnesty, another country does not have to respect that. They can hold you accountable, period.
The international forensic human rights movement has made significant contributions to ending the silence about the crimes committed during the Civil War and Franco era in Spain. The bones of Franco's victims are now being returned to their families for long denied proper and dignified burials. Communities stigmatized for decades for their support for the Republican side are now telling their stories without shame or fear. The names of disappeared persons are once again being pronounced and reintegrated into the national community. Forensic science has contributed to a dramatic transformation of Spain's memoryscape. After decades of democratic rule, the Spanish government is finally enacting far-reaching measures to distance itself from Franco's dictatorship and to open a long-overdue national conversation about Spain's traumatic past. I would like to thank Nicole for generously sharing her time and thoughts with me. For more on this topic, visit the Realms of Memory website at realmsofmemory.com, where I devote a page to each episode. Next month, we'll turn to the topic of the memory of the genocide in Rwanda. We'll hear from Boston University professor Tim Longman about his book, Memory and Justice in Post-Genocide Rwanda. If you've enjoyed this episode, please tell a friend and review us on your favorite podcast app. I'm your host, Rick Dadarian. Thank you for listening to Realms of Memory.